What if the greatest general America ever produced in World War II was also the most dangerous man in the room? Not to the enemy, but to the very alliance holding the free world together. What if the man who led armored columns across North Africa, crushed Axis forces in Sicily, and raced through France faster than any commander in history was simultaneously creating a crisis so severe that two presidents, a supreme Allied commander, and the entire structure of American military leadership had to reckon with what to do about him? This is not a story about battlefield glory. This is the story of what happens when a warrior's brilliance becomes indistinguishable from his volatility, when success on the ground starts costing more than it wins in the halls of power, and when the men responsible for holding the Grand Alliance together had to make impossible choices about one of their own. General George S. Patton Jr. was, by almost every measurable standard, the most electrifying combat commander the United States Army produced in the 20th century. But by the autumn of 1944, and certainly by the spring and summer of 1945, his name had become something else entirely. A problem, a liability, a fire that burned everything it touched, including the hands of those trying to wield it. If this kind of story moves something in you, the collision between genius and power, between history's demands and a single man's flaws, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. And drop a comment below telling us what you already knew about Patton, and what surprised you, because what comes next goes far deeper than the legend. Dwight D. Eisenhower had known George Patton for decades before the war. They had served together, studied together, and understood each other in the intimate way that only career soldiers can. Eisenhower knew that Patton was irreplaceable in battle. He had seen it firsthand. When Patton took command of the American II Corps in Tunisia in March 1943, following the humiliation at the Kasserine Pass in February, he transformed a demoralized force into a fighting unit within weeks. His discipline was ferocious, his presence was theatrical and deliberate, and his results were undeniable. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered en masse, over 250,000 prisoners captured. Patton had played a central role in that victory, and everyone from Omar Bradley to Winston Churchill understood it. But Eisenhower also knew something else. He knew that Patton carried within him a self-destructive impulse, an arrogance so deep it occasionally crossed into cruelty, and a mouth that seemed constitutionally incapable of silence when silence was the only safe option. Managing Patton was not a secondary concern for Eisenhower. It was, in many ways, a full-time job running parallel to the actual war. The Sicily campaign in the summer of 1943 illustrated both sides of the Patton equation with brutal clarity. Operation Husky began on July 9, 1943, and Patton commanded the American 7th Army with ferocious ambition. He was officially subordinate to British General Bernard Montgomery in the overall campaign structure, and that arrangement grated on him like sand in a wound. Rather than accept his supporting role, Patton improvised, charged forward, and on August 22, 1943, his forces reached Messina hours before Montgomery's British 8th Army. A symbolic and deeply personal triumph that electrified American troops and infuriated the British High Command. The race to Messina became legend, but two separate incidents during the campaign threatened to unravel everything. On August 3 and again on August 10, 1943, Patton visited military field hospitals and encountered soldiers he believed were shirking their duty. In the first incident, he slapped Private Charles Herman Cole. In the second, he struck Private Paul Bennett. These were not anonymous moments. They were witnessed, reported, and eventually reached the press. Journalist Drew Pearson broke the story publicly in November 1943. The fury was immediate, sweeping, and bipartisan. Congressional voices called for Patton's removal. The American public, which had been fed a carefully constructed image of heroic sacrifice, now confronted a general who had struck a hospitalized soldier. Eisenhower's response was to reprimand Patton privately, force him to personally apologize to every man in the affected units, and then, critically, keep him in the theater. It was a decision that revealed everything about how Eisenhower calculated the cost of Patton's behavior against the value of his battlefield genius. The year 1944 brought Patton back to the center of history in a role that was, in its own way, as dramatic as any of his battlefield commands. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception designed to convince the Germans that the main D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, used Patton as its central decoy. The Germans believed, correctly, based on his reputation, that the Americans would place their most capable commander at the head of their most important assault. So the Allies fed that belief, creating the fictional First United States Army Group with Patton ostentatiously at its head. German intelligence accepted the deception. Adolf Hitler himself believed that the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, were a feint and held back critical armored reserves waiting for Patton's Phantom Army to strike at Pas-de-Calais. By the time the Germans understood the deception, the Allied beachhead was secured. Patton had won a victory without firing a single shot, by simply being himself, by being so feared that his imaginary presence froze an entire German army group in place. But even during this critical period, Patton could not stay silent. In April 1944, at a welcome event in Knutsford, England, he made off-the-cuff remarks suggesting that after the war, the world would be run by the British and Americans, without mentioning the Soviet Union. In the atmosphere of 1944, with the Grand Alliance absolutely dependent on Soviet military pressure on the Eastern Front, the remark was politically catastrophic. Eisenhower was furious. He wrote to General George C. Marshall on April 29, 1944, stating that he had temporarily decided to relieve Patton of command, only pulling back when it became clear that losing Patton before D-Day would be militarily devastating. By the late summer of 1944, Patton was finally unleashed. His Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944, and what followed was one of the most spectacular armored advances in military history. Between August and December of that year, Patton's forces liberated vast stretches of France and Luxembourg, capturing over 100,000 square miles of territory, crossing the Moselle River, and driving toward the German border with a velocity that left logistics gasping in his wake. He famously and urgently demanded fuel from Eisenhower's headquarters, insisting that if given enough gasoline, he could end the war by Christmas. His frustration when Allied supply priorities shifted to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in September 1944 was volcanic, and he made no effort to conceal it. To Patton, the broad front strategy Eisenhower adopted was a waste of his momentum, a bureaucratic timidity dressed up as strategic caution. When the Battle of the Bulge exploded in December 1944, and the German offensive threatened to shatter the Allied lines, it was Patton who performed perhaps his greatest logistical and tactical miracle, turning 3 full divisions 90 degrees in brutal winter conditions and driving north to relieve the besieged American forces at Bastogne by December 26, 1944. Even those who despised him acknowledged that the relief of Bastogne was an achievement of almost incomprehensible organizational mastery. But even in his finest hour, Patton was already moving toward his next collision with authority. By early 1945, with Germany collapsing on both fronts, Patton's Third Army was driving deep into the heart of the Reich. His forces crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, and in a moment of theatrical defiance that was entirely characteristic, Patton stopped in the middle of the pontoon bridge, unzipped, and deliberately urinated into the Rhine River. A gesture he had promised himself since childhood, echoing Caesar and Napoleon crossing their own rivers of destiny. His army swept through Frankfurt, Kassel, and drove into Czechoslovakia and Austria. In April 1945, American forces under Patton's command liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp, one of the first such facilities encountered by Allied troops in Germany. On April 12, 1945, Patton, along with Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, walked through the horror of Ohrdruf. Eisenhower, visibly shaken, insisted on personally witnessing every part of the camp. Patton reportedly became physically ill. It was a moment that cut through even his armor. And yet, within weeks of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Patton was already generating a new crisis, one that would not remain on the battlefield but would echo directly into Washington, into the White House, and into the calculating mind of a former haberdasher from Missouri who had only recently inherited the most powerful office on earth. If you're still watching this, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for, someone who wants more than the surface of history. So before we go further, subscribe right now if you haven't already, like this video to help more people find it, share it with a friend who thinks they know everything about World War II, and leave a comment telling us the most surprising thing you've learned so far. Because what Harry Truman said, and what it meant for America's relationship with its own military heroes, is the part most people never hear. Harry S. Truman had become President of the United States on April 12, 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly at Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman, a World War I artillery captain who had run a failing haberdashery in Kansas City before entering politics, was in many ways the opposite of Patton, unflamboyant, direct, instinctively skeptical of men who believed their own mythology. Truman had no patience for military prima donnas. He believed in civilian supremacy over the military with a conviction that was almost theological. He had watched, during his years in the Senate, how military careers could balloon into political movements, how generals could develop constituencies, how the uniform could become a vehicle for ambitions that had nothing to do with national defense. When Patton's post-war behavior began generating explosive headlines in the summer and autumn of 1945, Truman was watching carefully. On September 22, 1945, Patton gave a press conference at his headquarters in Bad Tolz, Bavaria, in which he made remarks that compared the Nazi Party to American political parties, suggesting that former Nazis should not necessarily be excluded from administrative roles in post-war Germany simply because of their party membership. The remarks detonated across the world press with the force of a tactical weapon. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, with the bodies of 6 million Jewish victims not yet cold, with the Nuremberg trials being organized and the world demanding accountability for Nazi atrocities, Patton had essentially defended the administrative utility of former Nazis. Eisenhower, now the commanding general in Europe, was left with no viable choice. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. It was not done with cruelty. Eisenhower offered Patton a new assignment commanding the 15th Army, a paper force responsible for writing the official military history of the European campaign. It was, by any measure, a humiliation for a man who had raced armored columns across continents. Patton accepted, but the wound was deep and visible to everyone who knew him. The man who had liberated hundreds of thousands of people from the Nazi boot was now being sidelined, in significant part, because of his inability to grasp the moral catastrophe that Nazism represented beyond its military dimension. Patton, who thought in terms of enemies and combatants and fighting qualities, seemed unable to process the Holocaust as the defining moral event of the era. Eisenhower understood that whatever the war had been militarily, what came after required a different kind of intelligence, a political and moral intelligence that Patton simply did not possess. When word of Patton's relief reached Washington, Truman's response was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Privately, according to accounts from his aide and close confidant General Harry Truman said that Patton had never understood what this war was actually about. He had understood how to fight it, Truman acknowledged, no one was denying that, but understanding how to fight a war and understanding why a war must be fought are two entirely different forms of wisdom, and a man who confused them had no business governing a defeated nation. What Truman said in more public or semi-public settings during this period was equally revealing. In conversations with journalists and congressional allies, Truman made clear that he viewed Patton's post-war behavior not as an eccentricity to be managed but as a symptom of a deeper danger, the danger that military success could breed in certain personalities a sense of immunity from ordinary moral and political accountability. Truman had watched Douglas MacArthur operate in the Pacific with similar imperial self-confidence, and he already understood that the post-war period would require reigning in the culture of the untouchable general. When Patton's remarks about Nazis circulated, Truman reportedly told aides that no man's battlefield record gave him the right to rehabilitate fascism, that the very soldiers whose valor Patton claimed to represent had died fighting precisely the ideology Patton was now treating as a manageable administrative inconvenience. Truman's fury was not merely political. It was personal and moral. He had served in the trenches himself. He understood the cost of that war in a way that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy or the movement of armored divisions across European plains. He understood it as a butcher's bill, paid in the currency of human lives, and he would not allow a general, however brilliant, however decorated, to casually undermine the moral logic for which those lives had been spent. Patton's removal from command of the Third Army was, in Truman's view, not just justified. It was necessary. The final chapter of George Patton's life arrived with a terrible swiftness that seemed to render historical judgment almost superfluous. On December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany, the staff car in which Patton was riding was struck by a military truck. The collision was slow speed and relatively minor. The other occupants were uninjured. But Patton, who had survived the carnage of 2 world wars, who had been under enemy fire more times than could be counted, who had ridden horses, commanded tanks, and directed battles from the front lines, broke his neck in the crash. He was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days, Patton lay in a hospital in Heidelberg, increasingly aware that he would not recover. He died on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. Eisenhower, who received the news at his headquarters, reportedly sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. The men who had served under Patton, who had followed his blood and guts theatrics through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, mourned with a grief that surprised even those who had witnessed his excesses. Truman, receiving the news in Washington, is said to have acknowledged Patton's death with the measured gravity of a man who had long since made his peace with the ambivalence of history's verdicts. Patton was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers he had commanded. A fitting end for a man whose entire identity had been inseparable from the army that formed him, used him, and ultimately could not contain him. What this story ultimately reveals is not simply the biography of a difficult general. It reveals the fundamental tension at the heart of all great military democracies, the tension between the warrior virtues that win wars and the civil virtues that must govern the peace. Eisenhower understood both worlds and navigated between them with the flexibility of a gifted diplomat. Truman understood, perhaps more than anyone in his era, that civilian control of the military was not a procedural nicety but a philosophical necessity, the principle upon which the entire experiment of Republican government depended. Patton understood neither of these things, and that gap between his military genius and his political blindness is the defining tragedy of his story. History is full of men who were indispensable in one context and catastrophic in another, men whose very strengths became liabilities the moment the context shifted. Patton was perhaps the purest example of that paradox in American military history, a man who was exactly what his country needed when the guns were firing, and exactly what it could not afford when they fell silent. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you didn't know, then this is the moment to act on that feeling. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story told this way. Like this video because it helps more people find real history told with the depth it deserves. Share it with someone in your life who believes they know World War II but has never heard what Truman really said about Patton, and leave a comment below telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest, because those comments are what keep this channel alive and growing.